The following is my conversation with Slate Olson. Slate was previously the Chief Marketing Officer of Rapha, as well as the Chief Marketing Officer of Specialized Bicycle Components, the President of Chrome Industries, and Senior Brand Director for Nike for Global Running, as well as Field Sports in the USA. There's a slight problem with his Bluetooth headphones up until about 7 minutes, and then he puts some wired headphones so the audio quality improves from 7 minutes on.
Slate Olson in the house. So happy to have you here, man.
Awesome to be here. Good to see you again, sir.
We're gonna have some fun today. So you have been with seen and lived in some of the most important moments in cycling brands. And so that's, we met when you were the president of Chrome Industries. But before that, you worked for Specialized and Rapha, and you're going to fill in all the other ones, but those are the ones that I knew of. So we're going to get into it. You got to see Rapha as it was a gigantic rocket ship kind of taking off. And I'm going to tell you, the business community around cycling is really, rightly so, really fascinated with the whole Rapha story still today. So I'm excited to bring some of that, open the hood, look underneath, and see kind of how that went, because I know you were part of the USA operation from the genesis.
Early days.
So here we go.
Yeah.
Tell me about yourself, Slate Olson.
Well, so my name is Slate Olson. I'm a slightly pudgy little kid from Eugene, Oregon, born and raised there, and then currently live in Portland, Oregon. And first off, excited to see you and thrilled to be part of this today. The fact is, I've been really lucky. And for all of those people who want to get well under the hood of the story, founder, friend, Simon Mottram, I think is nearly done with his book, which is going to be probably the most beautiful business book ever created.
Rapha's founder.
Yep. So being designed by Alton Coyle, who's responsible for a lot of the badges and special moment, kind of jerseys and things that were created, and written by Guy, who, was the creator of Ruler magazine. So with Simon, of course, overlording across all of that. But I mean, like everybody else, I'm really excited to see how that book's going to come out and what stories he shares and tells. So yeah, great to be here.
So you got started, maybe we can start off just kind of how you got interested in cycling, and maybe just what brought you to the sport, maybe professionally at the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, I might be a little bit on the older side nowadays, and so I actually started cycling just as a kid, and then I kind of turned cycling into a business because I had a paper route for about 6 years. So every morning I would be on my BMX bike at 5 a.m. throwing papers, and just kind of always, like, the bike to me was freedom, right? As a young kid, which when I hit 16, that turned a little bit into a car, but I sort of stayed with it. I moved down to San Francisco right after I graduated. I went to the University of Oregon ultimately, and started working in advertising and brand, and was still kind of just loosely cycling, most agency side.
Okay.
Yeah, so I came up agency side, working kind of across everything. And I took a job with a group called Butler, Shine, and Stern, who actually had done a lot of work, in the cycling space once upon a time. Wasn't working on any cycling accounts, but I lived in San Francisco. They were in Sausalito. So pretty much 5 days a week, I had the luxury of riding across the Golden Gate Bridge down into Sausalito just for my commute, and loved it. And I just remember watching, there was a bunch of pros or neo pros in that area. So sometimes I'd be coming back up, I think it's called Alexander Road or what have you, kind of out of Sausalito back to the bridge. And dudes would just fly by me, full kit, looking the part. And I started to get more and more intrigued I'd been a runner. That was sort of my forte, pretty decent, like 10K, run some marathons, and sort of got the itch again to start riding road bikes, and actually really fell in love. I kind of found my way to the DFL cyclocross, bandit series, I would say, in the Bay Area. And that sort of started my love for what I would call competition, and moved up to Portland, ultimately kind of just in 2001 to go work for Nike. I worked for Nike a couple of different times, but that time was really lucky to find both the cross country running scene. There was this group called Red Lizard Racing that would run a cross country route, then followed by a full day of cyclocross racing. So that was my transition where I started running a little bit less and started racing cross even more. And that, that brought together a whole new community of incredible people. And I just fell in love with cross and with Portland racing bike scene. And that was it. So that sort of began my foray, and which eventually led me to leave Nike.
So you started at Nike in what capacity?
I always tell people I'm just a marketing guy, right? So I started in marketing. I was working with some of the bigger accounts like Dick's Sporting Goods, Foot Action, Finish Line. And then a couple of years into that, moved into what was initially called advertising. So I worked in the advertising group. I did kind of worked across from working with retailers, working on our women's business. So I did a lot of our women's work. There's a poster that your audience can't see behind me, but Lauren Fleshman, we did this really compelling piece called Objectify Me, which was really focused on women and women's product. And then I also picked up this sort of side project within Nike, which was Nike cycling. So I was working,
Cool.
Nike and Trek had
Lance Armstrong.
Yeah, the alignment there. And then, so speaking of Lance, was at the table when we decided to do the yellow band, which started out with a swoosh and the words Carpe Diem on it. That was our first batch. And then working closer and closer with the Live Strong Foundation, took off the swoosh, put Live Strong on it. And then next thing you know, I don't know what was sold.
Everybody
90
had
million yellow
those.
bands. The greatest story I have about that was I was in Costa Rica with my wife on a surf trip, and was at a little taco truck, and a guy offered me an eighth of weed for my yellow band that I was wearing on my wrist. So I traded him for it. I figured, why not? Went in Costa Rica. I knew I could get more. Yeah. So the pink jersey behind me is actually Teo Gegenhardt's. So Teo.
Well, I just lost.
Wait, can you hear me now?
Yeah, now I can hear you. Yep.
Okay. Isn't that why you're good? You hear me there?
Yep.
Okay.
Good.
Cool. So the pink jersey. So Teo Gegenhardt, as you might remember during the pandemic, and when the Giro was run in September, came out the winner on top of that, which is incredible, right? And unfortunately, he just crashed out. He had his first major crash this season in the Giro, and I just talked to him this morning. Actually, he's recovering well, which is awesome. But he is somebody that I've known since I think he was 13, introduced by James Fairbank, who was a part of Rapha and leading the brand with us for a good long while. And Teo just kind of started hanging around. He was a great local young kid who was racing with James in Hackney, and came on some photo shoots. It was always just been, with his red hair, charming and lovely and well beyond his days, and turned out to be a pretty damn good bike racer. So
sounds like
a relationship that I hold really near and dear, to this day. And it's been fun to watch a kid who you met when he was basically 13 or 14 grow into the man you always thought he would be. So he's a dear friend, and it was very kind of him to send me one of his jerseys from his Giro victory.
Wow. So going back to where we were talking about your time at Nike. So you're at Nike working on some projects. Sounds like you got to help with the cycling initiative as well. So then how did that end up turning into, I'm assuming Rapha is the next step?
Yeah. So, I was working on kind of a lot of great stuff, including Live Strong, which, again, all the stories we know now are still true, but it's hard to argue that the impact of what, the yellow band meant at the time. And then started to just kind of wonder if there was something else out there. And so I happened to, I was working in advertising. I had 3 or 4 friends, all super early day Rapha adopters and fanatics, who kind of in the span of a week, I had this RFP. They were looking for a general manager of North America that came to me from 3 different parts of my life.
Oh, wow.
And so I kind of felt like that was kismet, needed to at least take a go. And so
they wanted to expand to North America, and this would have been 2015
This was,
Six?
yeah, 2007 is when the
7.
conversations started. So mid 2007, I think they were, they were shipping out of London and doing a little tiny bit of business and knew like pretty much every European brand. Like they knew North America was an opportunity they needed to crack and had, like
No idea how to do it.
big dreams and no idea and, learned everything that every European brand learns, which is like,
It's
you
horrible and
know,
expensive and
and difficult. And like, well, London is an easy place to crack. You've got New York,
or
LA. It's just
Germany.
a
Yeah.
massive country.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, long story short, kind of came out the other end of a search that they did and convinced them to keep it in Portland and really sort of built Rapha out of Portland because I had no desire to leave Portland. Obviously, I had a great community
Wow.
here. The writing's great. Life was good. So that's kind of how that began. And we really we built the office, built a team, really focused on how do we grow and build the brand? What are the events and energy that we could create? Working with some pretty crazy and wonderful people like Daniel Paisley, created the Rapha Continental, which, certain friends of mine from, who were then at Chris King were like, yeah, what gravel is today has some, sort of tones of what, Rapha kind of set out with this idea of the way we showed gravel experience and kind of exploration through that. So it was great fun. And then moved in 2013, had been working on the Team Sky Rapha relationship for a little bit out of here. Obviously, I'd worked a lot with Discovery and Postal with my kind of Nike cycling experience, and finally got convinced to move over to London, which was, 2.5 years of incredible, like just life experience.
So you were running the US office, which for anybody that doesn't know, Rapha was a D2C brand. Was it D2C from the start, or did they have some store presence at the beginning?
We had some store presence, and so we had, sort of hand selected what we thought were some of the
Right.
best
Sure.
best people, best
Boutiques.
shops throughout
Mhm.
North America. So, Signature Cycles in New York, the boys down in Mill Valley, Velo, I've just forgotten their name.
But like destination shops.
Yeah, just the ones that really were kind of tastemakers. I think River City
Okay.
Bikes in Portland is a great example, right? Like if you wanted to be in Portland, and it was really important to us, and I saw it as much, I mean, beyond sort of the retail sort of revenue, it was really a media cost exposure. So that margin loss, if you will, paid off in dividends, is thinking about like being in the right places with the right
Sure.
people talking
Yeah,
about you.
and that's an interesting take, because I think at the end of the day, like so then they did pivot to D2C only, right? Like there was a day where you had to make phone calls and be like, yeah, sorry, we can't sell to you anymore.
That was it. Yeah, that was kind of a shitty day. It was one where Simon Mottram and I definitely had some arguments about with regards to like the relationships we had were really strong, and the authenticity and the legitimacy that being with the right shops had is super important. But, much credit to Simon. His view and vision always was, really creating kind of the ultimate D2C brand. And,
Okay, so
and there's
he
a
wanted
lot of
to,
advantages to that.
sure, of course, and so he wanted to just be a pure player D2C.
That,
That was
that was the goal. And we had some proof points, right? We did the first pop-up shop in New York on the Bowery, where we had the first cycling cafe, now called Rapha Cycling Clubs. And then, proud to admit in Rapha's history that the San Francisco Cycling Club was the very first permanent, Rapha retail shop. So we took an H-fan and made that a parklet outside, which created outdoor space, and started to run rides and really kind of drive the brand on the West Coast from that location.
the focus was D2C, obviously,
Yeah.
with just physical stores that were owned by the brand.
Physical stores owned by the brand that could really create community and be these clubhouses that, really were kind of the case and have proven to be true. How do we create, I think energy, places for a congregation and storytelling. And, I think what made Rapha, I will forever give full kudos to Simon Mottram for having the most beautiful brain I've ever seen, both sides. He's a trained accountant, right? And one of the world's leading brand valuationists, as he was working for a company called Interbrand, who also was absolutely like, I think about him often because I could not beat him very often on either side of an argument, because he had all of the history, all of the passion and absolute love of riding and of the sport. and then had made a ton of great decisions working with Ben Ingham, who was really, responsible for the photography and the essence of the brand for such a long time. Just gave a really fertile place in which to kind of build and grow a brand and build a base of riders that could fall in love with something kind of season in, season out. So
I think we're gonna have to do an episode 2 on just diving into Rapha, because we've got so much to cover today. So
there's a ton, yeah.
So you moved to London to then take on what role?
So in essence, I was CMO. So I was running global marketing.
Okay.
I'd
Whereas in the US, you were more operations.
I was, still predominantly marketing. Like the US was predominantly but I did a lot of operations. We set up a DC, our distribution center here,
Sure.
and we did a lot. But, I'd kind of de facto been taking a global role in marketing, working with Daisuke in Japan, working across with our team in Australia. And so I've been doing a lion's share of that work for some time, and this just sort of made it official. And again, that sort of correlated with the time in which, a slight, not shift in strategy, but a move in strategy with when we were launching Pro Team, that line of jerseys, because we've been predominantly wool and club cut. And so we were going into more performance, kind of corresponded with the signing of Team Sky. So
okay,
all of those things kind of came together.
I heard a
okay.
rumor.
Yes.
You're gonna be able to answer, dispel this rumor that the first year of Team Sky, you guys didn't pay them anything.
That's what I wonder what can be shared. We didn't pay them very much, that is for sure. The relationship with Dave Brailsford and everybody at Sky was one that was seen as an investment. So we were not, spending the kind of numbers that a lot of other people were in order to get that, which I'm sure sometimes they probably wanted a refund, because we definitely had those first year problems of, make and fit and cut.
And the sunburns.
And sunburns. And there was a terrible moment, which I'm sure Simon's going to hate me sharing, but we were watching Milan San Remo during the snowy race. You remember when they actually bust the guys? They had like a halftime almost. They got to the pass. It was impassable. So they bust them down to finish the race. And then suddenly they walked out with Castelli, the Gavi jerseys on, and
Gavi jerseys, yeah.
Yep, we were like, "What in the watching it in London, just losing our minds." And
Steve Smith licking his fingers.
And Steve's a good friend and a great.
he's a Nike alum too.
Former, yep, exactly. And so we understand the riders needed to be safe; they needed to be protected. And
sure.
If anything, it just kind of put the bit between our teeth to make sure that we were upping our own game with regards to serving riders in every sort of function that they needed. And
that's no joke. I mean, Rapha, took all the cycling brands to the woodshed with regards to the style, but
early days,
but probably for the real performance clothing, you guys probably had to take some lumps, I'm sure.
We learned quickly, learned often, and then I think ultimately started to make some of the best performance, that stood up to everything else that was out there and probably transcended in some ways as well. So that's what I did. And I was there for, 2.5 years. And then I had some bad luck, which is just like I had an older sister who passed away somewhat unexpectedly. And so it was around a time we were trying to make the decision, were we going to stay in London? Again,
you were with your family?
So wife, 2 kids, West Coast pretty much all my life. And so that passing sort of just, as it does, makes you kind of think about what are we doing? What do we want to be? I'd also pulled my wife. She's a physician, so she's a doctor who was unable to practice in London, obviously, right? Because those things
sure.
don't correlate.
Right.
And so we made the decision to come back.
Yeah, the investment sounded like the investment was for your benefit, for the family's benefit, obviously, but it sounded like you were a big part of it. So then you guys came back to
Specialized.
And this is when you took the job at Specialized.
Yeah, so I
15,
I'd met
14, 15.
15. So I'd met Mike Sinyard actually before Pinarello got official for Team Sky. There was one moment. I still have a Mark Cavendish World Champ jersey, Rapha livery, and Specialized logos on it, because we did some prototypes just in case. And again, this is probably all going to get me in trouble, but you know what? I'm fine with that.
He sold the joint, so
exactly. So that was a conversation. It was the first time I'd had a chance to meet Mike Sinyard in person. I had received a note from him about 7 months earlier. he had done a ride that I had a part of my team for, and he just shot a lovely note that said, "Hey, I met this woman. There's a woman named Carrie who worked in the small Rapha office here, and was just really impressed by her. And I love the fact that he took the time to be like, love what you're doing. Really great to meet her. What an ambassador for the brand." And so that kind of made for an easy conversation when I was going to talk to Mike and team about what we might do together with Team Sky. Obviously, things changed and Pinarello came back on, which was awesome. That's an incredible group of people. But through that, Mike has a wonderful knack of just checking in, right? He's a check-in kind of guy, and like, hey, what are you doing? And he does it.
What's the strategy behind that, you think? Just, I mean,
What-
obviously, not. I
Yeah.
mean, obviously, just relationships are important, regardless. But I mean, he's a businessman, and it sounds like he
Yeah.
likes to keep contact with people he considers
He
proficient at it.
does.
In there. Is that fair?
I think that's a great way of putting it. I think it's partially just it's a way for Mike to also kind of find out and hear different voices of what's going on.
That's
So beyond
super important
view
in
he
cycling.
has.
You have to see what's going
And
on because things change so fast.
and I think he had, he'd kind of built a lot of admiration for what we had done at Rapha. And so I think it was just, I would say Mike, and we can talk about Mike a lot. Like Mike was in a lot of ways kind of a fast friend, again, for me as a, let's say a young kid, especially in comparison to Mike, like it's hard not to admire what he had built,
Sure.
right? And where his brilliance was and where it lays. And so, yeah, so he called me one day and he said he forgot I was in London. I don't think he actually forgot, but we started to have this conversation, which ultimately then led to like, all right, if I'm going to go back to the States, and I talked about staying with Rapha, and maybe there was a different role I could keep,
Sure.
because obviously 7 years of my life that I consider some of the best 7 I've had, but also just a chance to kind of evolve and move on. And so that ultimately ended up in mine going to be the CMO over it at Specialized. So we moved from London to the lovely little town of Los Gatos as a family, and
California.
yeah, California.
So
Yep.
tell me about the mandate that you had from Mike, because I imagine when you take a role like that, like there's clear goals, right?
Yeah, I think there's a funny story we can get into another time with regards to that. I was coming in to lead brand originally, and then I had working with a European company, there's a 3-month notice period. And by the time the 3 months were up, I'd gone from kind of leading brand to then CMO. And so really, the mandate was sort of all of it. I think Specialized was just coming off one of its first down years in a little while with regards to kind of business and revenue. A big area was, how do we elevate the storytelling? How do we connect and really kind of prop up the brand across and building better, more insightful kind of relationships, thoughts, et cetera, with the product team and how we bring product to market. Like, the biggest difference for me between Specialized and Rapha, and it was a bit jarring at first, is Rapha led with brand, led with story. Specialized was very much innovate or
Product.
die, right? It was product. But, but we all know that, like, to some degree, there's a ubiquity of product, right? There is
The
a
world doesn't need
claim
any
that-
more products.
No, and it's really important. Like, what Specialized does is at the front edge of a lot of things,
Always.
but without the strength of brand and story and all of that, then it's just a product to product and price conversation. And so, like, the real ask is, how do we
Features.
yeah, exactly. So text and specs matter a ton, and I'm
Sure.
always surprised by how much a photo on IG of a bike, like what that will trigger versus like, wait, this is a beautiful story. Are you kidding me? But we did some great things. Like, I'll go back to the Rio Olympics, right? I don't know if you remember, but we actually came out for Rio. We did the color changing paint with temperature. And so you actually, it was an amazing moment. We took it across helmets. We took it across bikes. We had water bottles that would actually change, and they'd go from orange to yellow. And so there were moments as the road race was happening, and same thing for mountain bike, but as they'd go into the shadows of the trees, you would actually see the bike try to change colors. And working with Elaine and the team on the product side was an incredible story of just sort of energy and transformation and all of that. So to me, that's always been a really great example.
You had Sagan too, right?
Yeah, and so like getting Peter to be a special, like, he was an athlete as a part of our teams, but signing Peter as a Specialized athlete as an individual was really exciting. And so kind of early days, I still, I remember kind of one of the first meetings with the product team and design team and down in SoCal, just kind of talking about the vision for what we were going to try to do and set that underway. And so it was a great time. And then you had, obviously world champs in Richmond. was a great
Yep.
moment in cycling for the US, and a huge moment for Specialized as well.
Okay.
So yeah, exactly. So it was incredible. Not to mention all the other great work. I mean, you think about some of the stuff we did that often gets overshadowed, whether it's in helmets
Red
or
Hook Crit.
footwear. Red Hook Crit, we had, that incredible work. Kevin Franks, if you've ever come across him at all, like he was early days on adventure riding. And so they were doing some pretty incredible stuff there as well. So all of which made Specialized in some ways a little nervous with its like passion for racing to go off and exploring. And then this was kind of early days, Levo and all things e-bikes, and it was incredible. And yeah, I mean, I've heard a lot of things about Mike Sinyard. I remember once reading a bicycling magazine article that I think was like, "Is this man Satan?" was actually the headline. And what I would say is that, I have a ton of love for Mike as a human being. He's definitely got his things that he's a founder, right? Founders are different.
Sure.
But for me personally, he's through a lot of thick and thin, and someone I consider a dear friend still today. Don't always like Mike. We jokingly said, we moved up to Portland, so I was there just a touch over 2 years, and then kind of back to my life. My wife, had been well pulled off her path by moving abroad, by having kids. And so we needed to get back to Portland. So we kept our home up in this area, and it allowed her to do what she set out to do and actually become, a physician for that. And I think when Mike and I finally kind of had the last conversation, he said, "Well, I'm really going to miss all the meetings where we agree to disagree," which is what I said that to Mike. "Well, I think we agree to disagree." And I don't get the sense a lot of people said that to him very often. So
Sure.
a lot of respect.
So you spent little over 2 years at Specialized?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it sounds like for family reasons, you decided to then.
Yeah. And I
back to
looked at
Portland.
Mike and we had talked about ways that I could stay, whether it was, do we open an office in Portland that was maybe focused, or do I do the, Monday flight commute, come home Thursday night?
Sure.
And I like being a dad. I like being married, and the idea of not doing that. So that sort of opened up, more of the need to make a change. Otherwise, I was, for all the slings and arrows and fun and games that sometimes happens when you're working in this business, I loved what we were doing. I think the people at Specialized are super talented. I'm always impressed by the product they make. And again, I have a big soft spot in my heart for Mr. Sinyard. He's well different than Simon Mottram when I think about founders. But then, so that opened up Wyatt to returning a phone call that I hadn't been returning, which, took me to Chrome. And so Chrome was, the original founders had sold to Rory First, who's the guy who started Keen and Keen Footwear.
Shoes,
so the ugly sandals, I like to call them. And so they've been kind of bobbing along in San Francisco, and, it connected to the bike industry, especially in what I'll call peripherals or soft goods.
Sure.
It was a really hard city for people to work and live in at the kind of price, salaries and stuff that we were able to pay, right? Pretty small business, hadn't been terribly healthy with regards to at a business level, lots of inventory, not hitting revenues.
You came on as the president, right? Let's give people an idea. So Chrome, it's a little bit smaller brand, but it's an incredibly unique brand. So they started off with the messenger bags, and then they got into footwear and clothing. Now that gets to be dangerous from a standpoint of inventory, right? I mean, because you have to do some forecasting. I mean, maybe if we want to dive into that, because it sounds like that was from what I've heard, I know that that company has had a lot of different leadership.
Yeah.
And it just feels like it's maybe always kind of close to the scale it needs to be, but just doesn't quite get there, looking at it from the outside.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about it.
No, I think your outside perspective is right. Like, I think, at its core, I mean, it started in San Francisco, kind of in the heyday of messenger culture. So you had, like that, and I think that ultimately is a little bit of its identity crisis as it was and as it still is, which is
it cycling? Is it messenger? Is it fashion?
And it's really kind of, it's the lifestyle of cycling that in large part the messenger bag culture and the style and all of that had evolved at this point in time. And so, great iconic, definitely a great brand.
Great
The sort of
products. Great products.
the seatbelt, buckle
Yep.
is definitely a thing of legend. And so I think the biggest challenge there, again, walking in, it had lost, it's not a big company, but it
No,
was on
no,
a
it's not.
streak of losing money. And then on the flip side, just getting choked with aged inventory, and probably a lot of it kind of considered less than sellable at that point, right? Because it was just
Okay.
not the right product.
So
Um,
they
and
would have maybe gone into some new lines and launched some new lines that just kind of
didn't work,
didn't
right?
work. And then when you do something like that, because they were producing in the Far East, so
Yeah,
you're looking at maybe $1 million in inventory that's stuck on a company
yeah.
that does 15 million or whatever it does, 20 million.
Yeah, I think
And
when we walked in, we were almost at about 3.5 to 5 million of bad inventory, basically, or
wow,
aged
and that's
inventory.
like,
So
so that,
yeah,
and that was like 25% of turnover, 20
and
20% of turnover.
yeah, and a lot, and again, I think things that for where we were and where we wanted to go probably weren't the best representation of the brand, right? And so we we
Sure.
we found a lot of smart ways in which to kind of just liquidate, get that out kind of below the scenes, while we could kind of identify the new opportunity, which is how do we continue to make? And we were making both in Chico, California, and in Asia, right, from a bag standpoint. And again, the majority of what we were making in apparel and footwear was coming from Asia. And so it became a really a debt that was on the books while we're trying to build and go forward. We'd identified kind of two different groups. There was kind of the rider that was like what I would kind of was probably more similar to where we'd begun, right? With messengers and people who were massively dedicated, and they, even if they were commuting, they were probably doing long commutes. Maybe, we had a lot of stories and people we met like 40, 50 miles coming in from wherever into the city, and they would give it a go. And then we had what we called the roller, right? Which in the roller was somebody who rode their bike through town, but
Sure.
just like they were dressed normal, so to speak. They were dressed for work. They wanted a great bag that had slightly different cues and performance needs. Then they really trusted what we made, which was, I think often referred to as like bomb proof gear. But they didn't want the messenger bag look. They weren't keen on a 2-pound belt buckle around their chest, as they were wearing a suit and tie, but they had, like the bike was their major mode of transportation. And so I think that was a little bit of this moment of like transformation where we were trying to expand, refine in some ways, but keep our roots. And ultimately I remember a conversation with the owner, and he was sort of reminiscing on like, I love the old days when you come into a chrome shop and you weren't sure if you were going to get served or you were going to get spit on. And I was like, I kind of think the world is well moved on past, that. I think, I hate to inform you, but yeah, that messenger culture is not what it once was, right? It's not seen
Right.
in the same light. And
So,
so
so
that
was
was
it was a sort of a try and find the avatar, the right avatar. It sounds like there were
right.
two.
Yeah.
And then it was kind of like, I don't, it feels like you're telling me though that even with those avatar improvements, it was still sort of hard to support what the brand was offering.
I think it was, yeah, that was the case. And I think it was, we were spanning the gap. And I think one of the coolest projects we did was with Chinelli and Antonio, with all of the work that we did around Red Hook and the different bikes with artists. I think it was this funny mix that I would say we were really close to getting right, which is like, how do you create, in essence, really smart carry for people who are going through their lives, kind of who had grown up to some degree, had jobs, had kids, but still wanted a little bit of the attitude. Then there was the element of racing, right? Because we definitely did not want to not be a part of like where culture is built. And we still think whether it was outlaw races, Red Hook, other ways that we were involved in the local racing communities, like we wanted to be a part of that because those were our people, and that's where energy came from, and could really inform not only product creation but also like culture. And I think that was the big thing that we were trying to find, is like, what is the new version of cultural relevance that we had through product and through our brand that would allow us to kind of grow and expand, but also stay really true to our core. And so I think that was a little bit of that very messy middle for a brand that had probably been not tarnished, but definitely a little bit, duffed and all of that for a few years. That was trying to come back out and kind of wipe off the Griffin, which is, the icon for the brand, and let it fly in some different ways. And it just ultimately became, a really tricky challenge for me to kind of navigate the future with what I would say is somebody who was somewhat holding on to the past and
Okay.
needing to let go of some sacred cows. And so that ultimately got me steering back, and I'd run into an old friend because back in Nike days, and took me back to Nike for a few years, which I did until February 22.
So okay, so after Chrome, you went back to
Yep.
Nike, and that would have
Yep.
been back in the marketing department again?
Yeah, back in marketing. So I ultimately was running for, half of that time I was running global brand for running. So
Okay.
working really closely across women's was the focus for sure, but just in general. So yeah, I had a chance to get back into the swoosh. There were a lot of things that felt very similar and a lot of things that weren't. And I probably had spent too many years in the cycling industry because big corporate bureaucracy, which is something I didn't like the first time around when I was at Nike, really got frustrating because I'd seen and known what we'd been able to do with smaller budgets, smaller teams, more impact. And so I was, really happy, really successful in a lot of ways and changing a lot of the mandates, I guess, within the brand, and helping to kind of turn around running for Nike. And then it proved that so much, bike racing is about minimizing energy waste, right? Like you want to minimize the waste and then maximize the effort when the time is needed. And I just I thought a lot about bike racing analogies because I felt like I was always being asked to just chase off the front for internal reasons. And then by the time you got there and it was time to get external and actually have the brand win, it was, you were beat. And so I had a chance to kind of just reimagine. So took some time off, and then 7 months ago, went into hospitality for the first time, kind of hospitality. I'm working for a company called Lodge Camps now, which is really an outdoor brand that just happens to do it through hotels. So that's what I'm doing now, still in marketing. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, no, I mean,
Yeah.
amazing journey you just took us on. I think there's definitely a couple more episodes in you, one for Rapha and definitely one for Specialized. But no, this was really fun,
Yeah.
and I'm glad to hear you're doing well. Family's
Having fun.
growing.
Life is good. Yeah, no, and I think the thing that I say to everyone is, man, how lucky am I? Right? Like I didn't have a plan. I didn't know this is where I was going to do. I spend the majority of my life in sport, outdoor, and cycling. And, I would say 99 days out of 100, the people I've met along the way have been some of the most incredible, creative, talented, athletic. It's the ride is far from over, but it's been a fantastic ride so far. And I really feel fortunate to have worked at the places I have with the people I have and come across some incredible humans. And so it definitely still gives me goosebumps. And occasionally I look over my shoulder and be like, is this really the case? It's not always easy, but that's the point, right? If it's
I'll
easy,
admit it. When I first
any-
met you, I was like, "That's Slate Olson, ex Rapha, ex Nike, ex Specialized," and you're like,
yeah,
you were just literally the most down to earth person. I think you gave me a
yeah,
bag. You're like, "You have a bag?" I'm like, "Yeah, I have a bag.
well,
Still have it, by the
thanks.
way."
I'm still just a chubby kid from Eugene who's just happy to be here. So
I think honestly, in my experience, the people that are down to earth and the people that are, just easy to
yeah.
easy to be around and easy to get along with, I think that is a real kind of a requirement for success. So I
Well,
think you're
and I mean, and again, yeah, your old boss too. Like Antonio Colombo is a fucking legend, right? And like Dario Pegoretti, and like, there was so many moments where I learned early days working with athletes and celebrities, like I'm not an autograph guy, but there's definitely been some moments in the cycling space where I'm kind of like chuckling and smiling to myself and like, oh my God, I am walking around the Columbus factory with Antonio Colombo. I'm going to remember this forever. And the thing that I think is, to me, has you know never allowed anything to tire is like there are some incredible humans, talented, creative, amazing business people, obviously some killer bike racers. they're kind of just like us. They just have seen a little bit more, done a little bit more, and specialized. And so I'm still enamored by the whole thing, which is fun. It's lucky to say.
Thank you,
Yep.
Slate. You want to tell people where they can find you if they want to follow you or connect with you?
Yeah, I'm sort of everywhere and nowhere, but my Instagram is just Slate Olson. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm terrible about checking messages, as Wyatt probably knows, but I go in fits and starts. But those are the main ways. I mean, you can, it's easy to find me. There's only one Slate Olson at Gmail, and that's me. So you can ping me there, and you'll see a nice mix of things I love to do, see my kids growing up, a lot of outdoor adventures. Had a great being back in the Northwest, and the ski season we had this year has been incredible. And I think that's the thing I've said a couple times in recent, like I'm finding myself to be way less boring nowadays, now that I'm not, 100% road rider. I'm playing soccer again. I'm skiing. I'm doing this. I'm climbing. So I've had a good time just sort of reimagining myself as you do, as you have to do as you get older, and taking a lot of different lessons and learnings from sport, which I think has always been the thing I've loved most about sport, right? Is you learn a lot. You just have to pay attention. So,
well, thank you,
yeah.
Slate. Thank you again,
Absolutely.
and we'll be in touch for sure.
Great to see you, sir.
Okay, take care.
Pleasure.